You don't realize how quickly your life turns into a primitive problem set until the grid goes down and stays down. Not the romantic kind of off-grid living people post about online, but the kind where your phone becomes a useless glass brick within hours, your fridge starts to smell like a warning, and the city you thought was self-sufficient suddenly sounds quiet. Too quiet. And here's the uncomfortable truth nobody likes to admit. In a full grid failure, you don't run out of time first. You run out of prepared systems. Everything you depend on is secretly part of a chain you don't control. Electricity stops, then water pressure collapses, then communication dies, and after that, people begin making decisions they would never make on a normal Tuesday. What saves you isn't luck, it's a very specific set of supplies that act like compressed versions of civilization itself. 10 of them, to be exact, each one solving a failure your body cannot solve alone. Start with water, because everything else is just noise without it. In a grid-down scenario, municipal water systems lose pressure fast, and whatever remains in pipes is temporary at best. You need stored water, yes, but more importantly, you need the ability to make unsafe water survivable. That means filtration. A simple mechanical filter works by physically removing pathogens and sediment, but what people forget is that most deadly contamination in post-collapse water isn't visible, it's microbial. Bacteria and protozoa don't care how clear it looks. This is why survival filters are paired with chemical purification or boiling when fuel allows. Your body can survive weeks without food, but only days without water before cognitive decline starts quietly rewriting your judgment. This section is based on practical field survival experience rather than formal academic sources. Now think about food, but not in the way modern grocery habits trained you to. In a blackout, calories are not comfort, they are fuel allocation. Your brain consumes roughly 20% of your energy budget even at rest, and under stress, that demand increases. The smartest stored foods are not gourmet or varied, they are dense, stable, and require zero cooking. Fats and carbohydrates become strategic resources, not preferences. The mistake most people make is storing food that assumes cooking infrastructure still exists. When it doesn't, hunger becomes a psychological amplifier for panic, and panic burns energy faster than starvation ever will. Then there's light, something you never appreciate until darkness becomes permanent instead of decorative. Your nervous system is wired to interpret darkness as uncertainty and uncertainty as threat. A reliable flashlight or headlamp isn't just visibility, it's cognitive stabilization. The physics are simple. Photons hitting your environment reduce the brain's predictive load. Without that, every sound becomes suspicious, every shadow becomes a potential problem. Batteries matter here more than the device itself, because in long outages, energy storage becomes the real economy. But light alone doesn't preserve information. Communication fails next, and that's where most people psychologically collapse. A battery-powered or hand-cranked radio becomes one of the most important objects you can own, not because it entertains you, but because it reconnects you to a larger system that still has coherence. Humans are social risk assessment machines. When isolated from external data, the mind fills gaps with worst-case assumptions. A radio interrupts that spiral with something external and real, even if the news is bad. At this point, injuries become a hidden threat. Not dramatic trauma, simple things. Cuts, infections, untreated headaches, dehydration-related confusion. That's why a first aid kit in a collapse scenario isn't medical convenience, it's survival bandwidth protection. Even minor infections can escalate when hygiene systems fail. Bacteria don't become stronger, your defenses become weaker. Antibiotic availability, antiseptic solutions, and basic wound care tools act as multipliers for everything else you're trying to do. Fire is next, and it's not just about warmth, it's chemistry control. It sterilizes water, cooks food, signals location, and regulates psychological temperature more than physical temperature. Humans evolved around controlled combustion, which means your brain still interprets fire as safe zone architecture. Without it, nights feel longer, decisions feel heavier, and sleep quality collapses. But fire also consumes fuel faster than people expect, so the real survival skill is not ignition, it's conservation and controlled use. Then comes the supply most people underestimate until it becomes urgent: sanitation. When waste management stops, disease doesn't take long to follow. The physics of contamination in dense environments is unforgiving. Pathogens spread through water, surfaces, and air particulates in ways that scale exponentially in close quarters. Simple sanitation tools like disinfectants, waste bags, and hygiene wipes are not comfort items, they are disease boundary systems. In a collapsed infrastructure, hygiene is not about cleanliness, it's about preventing microbial ecosystems from forming where you sleep. Cash also becomes strangely important, not because money regains meaning, but because systems fail unevenly. Electronic payments die instantly without power. ATMs become metal boxes, but physical currency retains transactional flexibility during early collapse phases when people are still trying to pretend normal life exists. It loses power later, but in the transition period, it bridges gaps that systems no longer cover. And then there's energy storage, portable power banks, and small solar chargers. People often misunderstand them as phone accessories, but in reality, they are miniaturized survival infrastructure. They allow you to preserve communication, store information, and extend the life of essential devices. Electricity, once taken for granted, becomes something you ration like water. Finally, there is the supply nobody respects until everything else is gone: redundancy tools. Not one flashlight, but two. Not one way to make fire, but several. Not one source of water purification, but layered systems. Because the real enemy in a grid failure isn't scarcity alone, it's single points of failure. Systems collapse not because everything breaks at once, but because one broken link cascades into the next. And here's what ties all of this together: the psychological shift. When the grid fails, your brain will try to solve survival problems using social assumptions that no longer apply. It will expect systems to recover, help to arrive, infrastructure to respond. But survival in that environment belongs to those who stop waiting for restoration and start building microsystems immediately. The irony is that none of these 10 supplies are exotic. They already exist in your world right now, quietly waiting for a scenario you hope never happens. But hope is not a strategy when the lights go out and don't come back on. Because at that point, the question is no longer what you own, it's what you can still make work when nothing else does.